You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com. Bitcoin, Ether, Ripple, Litecoin, and more. Cryptocurrencies and other digital assets are taking the financial world by storm. This exploding market provides everything a savvy trader needs: volatility, volume, and liquidity. Provided you know how to find it. That's where we come in. Welcome to the Crypto Rundown. Each week, we'll break down the latest trading activity, trends, and developments on everything from coins to tokens, futures, and even OTC options. If it's moving the crypto markets, then you'll find it on the Crypto Rundown. Now it's time to dive into the exploding world of cryptocurrencies and digital assets. It's time for the Crypto Rundown.
All right, everybody, that music means it is time once again for a little program we like to call around these parts, the Crypto Rundown. The program where we break down everything going on the crypto side of the fence. Going to talk the options, the futures, the spot, the volume, the volatility, the OI, the unusual activity, all that good stuff, and a whole bunch more. My name is Mark Longo from theoptionsinsider.com, as well as, of course, from this fun network upon which so many of you have been mainlining these days. Pleased to see so many new earlobes joining us out here on the network these days. Remember, if you like what you hear, not just on this show, but on the full network, make sure you leave those reviews so new folks can continue to discover the program and indeed the network. More important than ever in these troubled times. And of course, keep those questions coming at us as well. We do love to hear from you guys. It's going to be a little bit of a crypto quick hits episode this show. Listeners, you know, so many things are wreaking havoc with our guest schedule these days. We have a non-pandemic disease-related issues, wildfires, hurricanes, all these other crazy things going on. So our guest schedule and a little bit of flux. I'm going to try to make that up to you a little bit tomorrow. We've got a double duty on Interview Tuesday coming up tomorrow to make some of that up. We'll have more great guests scheduled for the Crypto Rundown and get in the old crypto hot seat again in the near future. But now, without further ado, let's dive right on into the Bitcoin Breakdown.
It's time to explore the latest trending activity, trends, and developments across the world's leading crypto market. It's time for the Bitcoin Breakdown.
All right, everybody. Time for the Bitcoin Breakdown, the portion of the show where we do exactly that. We break down what the heck's going on in the leading digital asset out there. Of course, we're talking Bitcoin. A little bit of a downtrend, shall we say, since our last episode. Remember, we were off last week for the Labor Day holiday here in the U.S. So we're going back now 2 weeks to our most recent episode, and things were a little bit different in the Bitcoin realm as of that program. We saw Bitcoin at that show was threatening 12,000. It's about 11,728 on that show. Coming into today's show, a little bit of a different scenario. All of you out there watching the Bitcoin landscape know exactly what's been up. A little bit of a bearish turn out there in all things crypto. Coming into today's show, we're at about 10,664. Puts us down over 1,000 handles, about 1063 from our last show. So a little bit of a retreat there on the old Bitcoin. Of course, that brings in some interesting conversations about how correlated Bitcoin really is to the broad equities, because, you know, across that period, we saw a pretty pronounced sell-off in a lot of the equity markets as well. And, of course, a little bit of a rally out there coming into today's show. We'll get to that in a little bit. We have a listener question about all of that in a little bit. First, let's break down some of the analytics out there. A lot of these analytics coming at you from our friends over there in SKEW land. SKEW.com is the place to go. We're going to smatter in a little bit from the Genesis Vol folks as well. They do a pretty good newsletter over there. Check it out if you haven't already over there at GenesisVolatility.com is where you can go to register for that newsletter. Coming into today's show, the realized vol, which is the actual amount of volatility exhibited in the Bitcoin marketplace over the past 30 days, it's up a little bit. The sell-off has been a little bit of movement over there over the last couple of weeks. Down, I should say up from about 47% to 54%. Not a huge move, but a little bit of an increase out there. Not the same really in the 30-day implied. It was 54% on our last show, 56% this week. Remember, realized vol is looking back how much volatility has actually been exhibited in the marketplace. Implied vol looking forward 30 days to see what the marketplace is pricing in as an actual prognostication for volatility going forward for the next 30 days out there. So that one's slightly up, by 56%. The SKEW as well, which is a measure of the volatility level of the 25 delta put versus the volatility level of the 25 delta call. If you don't know what any of that means, check out some of our other programming on the network like Options Bootcamp or Options Playbook Radio to learn more about some basic options terminology up there. That's up a little bit as well. It was almost -3, about -2.7% on our last show 2 weeks ago. This week, up to about 6.2% out there. Call to put, interestingly enough, going on out there. Looking at the full OI now, it's actually down a little bit. It was at 75% on the call side from our last show, this time 65%. So puts getting a little bit more into action out there. The Genesis Vol folks noted that as well on their most recent newsletter, saying short dated SKEW, so the shorter dated options out there, noticeably bid to the puts. Again, not exactly surprising given what we've seen in the marketplace over the past couple of weeks. People are flocking into puts given the fact that we're off over 1,000 handles from our last show. However, if you go beyond that, you look a little bit farther out in the volatility term structure, so months beyond, let's say 1, you get a little bit of a different picture. The longer dated options are actually bid to the calls. So near term, hedging, a little bit of concern to the downside, understandable. Longer term, the bulls are still out there in force, bidding up the calls out there. So interesting stuff over there on the SKEW front. And on the vol front, looking at the term structure out there as well, which is kind of looking at the different months and the levels of volatility in each of them, that's still in contango. It's a very traditional structure for a lot of products out there, which means the longer term futures are bid up a little bit more than the near term futures, expecting a little bit of price increase going forward out there. Of course, a little bit of what the Genesis folks term a massive bump in the forward implied volatility in some of these longer dated options. And we've seen that in a lot of products of late. We talked about that a lot on our Volatility Views program, how there's a lot of election volatility baked into things like VIX and equity volatility right now. So it seems like we're seeing a little bit of a similar spillover effect into the Bitcoin vol term structure as well. Nov and Dece, according to the Genesis folks, pretty expensive right now compared to what we're seeing right now in the front month contract. Again, that's a little bit beyond the election, but the vol futures are doing the same thing. They're pricing in vol beyond the election as well. So maybe, again, leading a little bit to that argument that maybe Bitcoin not quite as uncorrelated as some folks may have been led to believe. Let's go to the open interest, see what's on the tape out there right now, or what's maybe coming off the tape. Let's see, DEREBIT still the big dog out there, 1.3 billion contracts worth of notional open. That's a bit off their high of about 1.7 billion, which came not too long ago. In fact, general open interest is off a little bit since our last show. Open interest peaked towards the latter portion of August. Obviously, August came off the tape. A lot of it came with it. In aggregate, across most of the major venues, OI was a little bit north of 2 billion as of the end of August, coming into that August expiration. And then it's kind of trailed off a bit now. See DEREBIT again about 1.3 billion. Then we've got number 2 out there, which is CME, holding down that number 2 spot pretty firmly, 213 million. They're 2 million off of their max OI. We'll get to that in a little bit, but what's going on over there on CME land? Then we've got bit.com, number 3 with 78 million, LedgerX number 4 with 49 million. We got some new names filtering into the SKEW analytics, so they're expanding their purview of venues that they cover, including Huobi. Huobi has a whopping 805,000 contracts. But you know what? That still puts them ahead of BAKKT which has a whopping 0. If we break it down by percent terms, DEREBIT's at about 74% right now. Seeing CME at about 12%, OKEX 6%, Bit.com 5%, LedgerX at 3%, and everyone else is pretty much de minimis. That's looking at you there, BAKKT. Still waiting for some numbers on BAKKT in terms of when they're going to put up some options. I guess we'll have to wait a little bit longer. Let's look at the overall options volume, lighting it up on DEREBIT since our last show. DEREBIT is still, of course, the big dog out there. Labor Day, or I should say the Friday before Labor Day, the 4th, was the big day out there on DEREBIT. About 227 million worth of notional going up on the tape that day. Prior to that, the most recent high we saw was back on August 17th with about 194 million going up out there. So in between that, it's been some decent days out there, but nothing really approaching that outside of that September 4th day, which was a pretty active day. We mentioned CME earlier. Some of the bigger prints we're seeing this week over there on the SKEW platform are coming from CME. Remember, SKEW adjusts these to make them in line with the other numbers coming out of other venues, which are mostly 1-to-1. One contract equals one Bitcoin. CME does it on a 5x multiplier. So SKEW takes the liberty of adjusting that volume by 5x to make it line up with everything else, which makes it kind of look a little bit outsized here when you analyze it on SKEW. Just keep that in mind if you're looking at some of this data. But then again, it's also relevant because that's pretty much what it means in terms of contracts on other platforms. The CME contract is a pretty big, pretty beefy 5X contract. And when you look at that, you're seeing CME dominate the tape out here this week with the print actually going up today. Looks like the 11,500, 12,000, 12,500 kind of vertical, funky vertical, three-way there, going up 1,000 by 500 by 500 times. Remember, that's 5X there. So really you're talking 200 by 100 by 100 out there. So a little bit of a funky vertical. We don't have sides on this, obviously, but it seems like maybe paper picking up the 11,500s and then selling a little bit of a vertical up there against it. And usually if you're seeing something like this, you might see a bit of a ratio beyond it. So maybe, 1 by 2 by 1 or something like that, as opposed to 2 by 1 by 1. That's a bit of a funky ratio to it out there. It's not a spread type we usually see going up out there, but ratios are kind of interesting out there in Bitcoin options right now. Other big print we saw going up was also a CME print going up on the 9th. It was the 11,300, 11,500, 12,000 vertical going up 500 by 500 by 500, aka 100 by 100 by 100 over there on CME land. This was done again on the 9th. I don't have where Bitcoin was where these prints went up like I have for some of the other ones. So we'll have to kind of just use our imagination, go back to those days for where Bitcoin was at the time. But interesting prints up here. So upside verticals seem to be the order of the day, and three-legged ones out here on CME as well. The Genesis folks also noted on the 4th, looks like what they termed a 1x2 of paper coming out and buying 150 of the 10,000 puts and selling 300, aka 1x2, of the 8,000 puts. This was on the 4th as well. So the 4th was a pretty busy day. Paper buying 1, selling 2. Makes some sense. You want to get a little bit of downside exposure here, but you also don't mind maybe picking up some Bitcoin around the 8,000 level. I think a lot of people out there would probably be in that similar scenario. Then that vertical, maybe it was a little bit attractive. A put vertical was done delta neutral. They point out there, so obviously no residual delta to that on that trade. So the 4th was clearly the big day out there since our last show. Looking at what's going up today, again, everyone's all the Twitter, pun intended, by these prints going up on CME. Also, DEREBIT had some 11,000 calls lighting up out there today, about 500 and change of those, and the 10,000 puts doing about 400 contracts out there on DEREBIT today. So not a ton lighting it up on the DEREBIT front. Seems like most of the interest has been on those interesting contracts going up on the CME front. We'll get to more on that in a little bit. First, let's break down where the action is centered these days across the months. Remember, we said it before, we'll say it again. Bitcoin and just in general, crypto folks like themselves some quarterlies, and that appears to be the case yet again. August off the board now, obviously. SEP fully in the front view there, and SEP has about 75,000 contracts open out there right now. That puts it over August. August topped out around 62,000 contracts. Of course, still not at the June levels. June had about 114,000 contracts open. Remember, this is combined across all the major venues out there. So SEP has a bit of a ways to go, but it looks like it might be on track, and we can keep some of these numbers up to maybe surpass June. And of course, beyond that is Dees with about 30,000 contracts, and everything else is a pale shadow. So once again, quarterlies dominating the tape out here in crypto land. Where the strike action is this week. Last show, the 12,000 strike was dominating the tape with about 13,400 contracts. Right now, it's still number one. It just has added another 1,000 contracts, 14,400 contracts for the 12,000 strike, which is kind of interesting because, as I mentioned there at the top of the show, we have pivoted away from the 12,000 strike a little bit since our last episode. We were threatening on the last episode, so it made some sense. Now we moved away, but 12,000 still the big dog, followed by 11,000 with 13,000 contracts open. Everything else is at about 9,900, just a little bit under 10,000, kind of a tie with 16,000, 9,900, then 9,400 each of the 9,000 and 10,000 strikes, and 9,700 of the 14,000 strikes. So a lot of even money strikes right at or around 10,000 contracts, with the big dog still 12,000 and 11,000 out. Let's go back out to CME land. Like I mentioned, pretty decent a couple of weeks out there in CME land. Seems like more paper starting to flow into these contracts. Last show, we were talking about most of the days 200 contracts or less. These days, last week and change, has been more than 200, about 200 or more. The few days, a lot more. We had 530 on the 3rd, 263 on the 4th, and 554 contracts going up on the 9th. That's not even including the paper we saw going up today out there, which is another decent size print. Remember, those are all 5X contracts out there. So decent paper starting to find its way into the CME Bitcoin options after having a little bit of a floundering, a little bit of a faltering and a struggle to find their footing in the early days out there. Some whales seem to have fixed their eye on the CME options out there and put up a little bit of numbers. Some people were speculating, is it Paul Tudor Jones? Who's driving the volume and the options and the futures? But right now, we don't know who it is, but it's a decent amount of paper out here. Not so much lighting up the futures side. They're taking a little bit of a break over the past couple of weeks. This week, a light volume week as well. Today, about 6,500 contracts on the tape. Last week, 5,500 on Friday, about 9,000 on Thursday, 5,500 on Wednesday. The big day was Tuesday, 16,000. Of course, some of that making up for the fact that Monday was closed on CME due to the Labor Day holiday. So maybe a little bit of Monday's volume finding its way into Tuesday. Either way, Tuesday was the big day out there. Not too many big days over there on BAKKT. So the BAKKT volume bot, our old friend, a good follow on Twitter if you are so inclined, so interested in such things. The BAKKT volume bot coming in with their most recent breakdown saying their traded contracts at about 6,700. Remember, that's a one-to-one contract, so that's a little bit easier to track the volume out there in terms of how many Bitcoin are actually changing hands out there. That volume is actually down about 23%. Again, their all-time high was right about almost 13,000 back on August 25th of this year. So they set that a little bit more recently, so that's good to see some decent new records coming in on BAKKT land. The open interest is a little bit north of 12 million, puts it up about 2% out there. Now let's go on out to the rest of the crypto marketplace and explore the altcoin universe.
It's time to move beyond Bitcoin and find out what's moving the rest of the crypto marketplace. It's time to boldly venture into the altcoin universe.
All right, everybody, welcome to the altcoin universe, a portion of the program where we break down everything else outside of the big dog that is Bitcoin. Let's start looking at the top 10 out there, see if there's been any interesting shakeups since our last. Oh, yes, there has been a very pronounced one. We'll get to that in a little bit. The top 3 changing for the first time in a long time, probably since we've been doing this show. I don't think that top 3 has changed, but this week, not the case. Let's start, though, at the bottom. Number 10, Litecoin. Another one, how the mighty have fallen. That was a top fiver for a long time. And now at number 10, 3.2 billion. Standard caveat applies. Take these market caps with a grain of salt. The rankings have some merit, but the overall market caps maybe a little bit more fluid. Crypto.com coin, 3.4 billion. Number 9. Number 8, Bitcoin Cash, 4.2 billion. Number 7, our old friend Chainlink, hovering there at number 7, 4.2 billion. Number 6, Binance Coin, 4.5 billion. Number 5, a newcomer to the top 5 here, Polkadot, 4.5 billion. Number 4, yes, I said number 4, XRP. It's been number 3 pretty much since we launched this show. Now bumped to number 4. I've been talking about that for a while. It seemed like Tether was eyeing that number 3 spot. And if XRP, if the recent trends continue, maybe it might give that bad boy up. Well, It happened since our last show here, or I should say XRP at just a little bit north of 11 billion for number 4. Number 3, Tether, 14.7 billion. So roaring past XRP. It's got a bit of a ways to go, though, to catch up to number 2. That's ETH, 42.5 billion. And of course, no one's catching the big dog anytime soon. That is Bitcoin at just a tick under 200 billion. We were north of that on our last show, but of course, giving up 1,000 handles is going to do that to you out there. Let's go on out to the number 2 out there in terms of most active options contracts. Also, of course, clearly from a market cap perspective, number 2. This is ETH. Taking a bit of a break as well. You know, when the big dog takes a break, Bitcoin tends to lead a lot of the other boats down with it. And that's what happened out here in ETH this past couple of weeks. Down 62 handles from our last show. We were north of 400 last time, 435. Now come in today's show about a 373 at the start of showtime. So a bit of a respite, a bit of a break, some profit taking maybe out there in ETH land. Let's move on out to the ETH options landscape, see what's lighting it up out there. Starting the vol landscape. Realized vol up a little bit. We have seen some movement since our last show. It was at about an 81%. Last show this week, 104%. So it's gapped up over 20 points just in the past couple of weeks. 30-day implied looking forward, that hasn't changed that much. It's hovered right around 75 for a little while now. It's up to about 77% now. So a little bit of a tick up, but not a huge change out there. On the volume front, a little bit different story. Pretty decent couple of weeks out there on the ETH front here. 59 million worth of notional going up on the 1st, 45 million on the 5th, and 40 million on the 10th. That compares pretty favorably to the recent highs we saw a couple of weeks ago on August 21st. That was about 46 million. So doing some new recent highs out there, even though overall the ADV kind of holding firm at about 30 million out there in ETH. Let's look at the SKEW really quickly. Our friends at Genesis love themselves some ETH. They're all about ETH and everything in the ETH ecosystem. Looking at the ETH SKEW out there, they're saying the ETH SKEW is more pronounced than Bitcoin with the short-dated contracts. Again, that's the nearer-term contract, listeners. They put on all caps, very bid to the put side. And again, like Bitcoin, you go a little bit farther out, that's where the call bid starts to make itself seen again. So longer term, the bulls are in charge. Near term, a little bit of concern. Again, kind of hard to fault anyone given what we've seen out there of late. Same deal on the vol term structure. It's still in contango, so longer term contracts more expensive than the near term contracts. And the same deal with that massive IV bump going forward. Again, maybe some of that election related, just maybe general unease and concern about the markets. Either way, we're seeing a similar bump out here in ETH that we're seeing in Bitcoin and a lot of other vol surfaces, quite frankly, out there these days. Volume-wise over here on DEREBIT, it's been pretty active. We're seeing, the max we've seen from ETH options has been about 66 million. Again, we're pretty close to that recently out there in DEREBIT land. OI, though, a little bit of a different story. Peaked towards the end of August. You saw a huge ramp up, closing in on 550 million. Again, that's across all of the venues, not just DEREBIT, but a lot of that has come off since August expiration. SEP hasn't really put it all back on yet. Looks like across the venues, it's hovering at around 460, 475 million or so. So a wee bit shy of the August highs. But again, crypto likes the quarterly. So if this trend continues, maybe by SEP expiration, we'll have surpassed what we saw out there in August. Moving on to Ripple, like we said, not exactly a good time here for XRP fans. Down a wee bit since our last show. We were at about 28 and change on last week's, or I should say 2 weeks ago. Come into this show about 24.4 or so. So giving up the ghost, not quite 4 cents, almost 4 cents, but not quite, pretty close to it. That's, of course, enough to topple it out of the top 3, move it down to number 4. I wish we had a healthy options ecosystem to parse here for XRP, but it's a 30 cent, or not even 24 cent contract out there. So kind of hard to have a robust options ecosystem when the underlying itself is a pretty cheap option out there. Same deal for Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin XV this past couple of weeks. Bitcoin Cash down 51.64. Bitcoin SV down about 31.5 since our last show. Now it's time for you guys to take the reins and answer some of your crypto questions.
You've got questions about crypto. Who doesn't? It's time to find out the answers to your crypto questions.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Crypto Questions portion of the show where you guys take the reins. We actually did a little fun poll at the end of our last show, which was inspired by one of your listener questions. We had a listener write in. I don't have the listener's name in front of me. It was on our last episode, though, where they were asking what we thought would be the next big hit in terms of crypto options marketplaces. So we thought we'd put it to you guys and see what you guys thought. We gave you 4 choices. Will it be ETH, XRP, Chainlink, or Tether? And looks like the results are in, and no surprise, you guys picked ETH. We kind of figured that was going to go that way, but we thought we'd put it out to you in case you had any surprises. Maybe there was a huge groundswell of love for Chainlink. Either way, 61, almost 62% of you chiming in for ETH. Number 2, XRP, 19%. So kind of breaking down along market cap lines, although Tether now has usurped XRP. Of course, that wasn't the case as of this poll. This poll expired before that happened. So maybe folks just voting with their market cap. Either way, 19% number 2 for XRP. Number 3, Chainlink, 14.3%. And Tether, a distant 4th place, not even 5%, 4.8%. So no love for Tether. Maybe if we did this poll again, given how the market cap has changed, maybe these numbers would change a little bit. But right now, clearly the number 2 out there, still ETH. I'm with you. I would love to see more products become really robust from an overall options perspective. We're just not there yet. So it's coming. ETH's going to be the number 2 for a while. Then maybe, who knows? Maybe if Tether keeps the rampage that it's on, maybe that could start driving some interesting flow. Maybe Chainlink, maybe XRP will get a little bit of a burst of price, and that'll make it a little bit more of a viable options candidate. Either way, ETH, at least for now. You guys have spoken. ETH, still your number 2. Next question, an interesting one. It kind of relates to what we were talking about earlier in the show. We kind of touched on this many times, including with our guest on our most recent episode, is really what is the nature of Bitcoin correlation? What is it? Is it correlated? Is it uncorrelated? We have a similar question. This comes from Alanist. I like this. Maybe he's an old school alienist in disguise. Either way, he says, are Bitcoin futures truly uncorrelated to equities? And that's an interesting question. So we crunched the numbers for you. Got some hard data on this. We went the listed route over there with the CME Bitcoin futures for a couple of reasons. We have some pretty good cross-asset correlation tools there. And also because that's a reference rate. So it's kind of aggregating the price action across multiple venues as opposed to just looking at one spot in one venue and trying to take some meaning from that. We went this route. Again, other venues may have different answers, but that's the route we went, comparing what's going on from a price action perspective in the futures versus some of the other big asset class futures out there as well. And we ran the numbers for pretty much the past year. So going back exactly 1 year, just to see what's going on. And, if you had to guess what you thought would be the highest correlation, if you said equities, you'd be pretty much on board. Over the past year, Bitcoin has had about a 39% correlation to the NASDAQ and a 37% correlation to the S&P 500. So hardly uncorrelated. It's a low correlation, but it's hardly uncorrelated. And certainly in times of stress like this past March when we saw everything melting down, including Bitcoin, that correlation gaps up closer to 1 probably. But so, and of course, those are the periods when you really need that to be uncorrelated, which is why I caution people who tend to view Bitcoin as this uncorrelated asset. We've seen it prove the opposite. So there is, over the last year, there's about a roughly 40% correlation to these large major indices out there. So bear that in mind if you're viewing Bitcoin as an uncorrelated asset. But we went beyond just equities. I thought we'd explore a little bit more and see what's going on out there. So we looked at energy. And actually a decent amount of correlation with energy as well. RBOB, of course, is about 33%. Heating oil, 32%. The one most of you probably know from that category, WTI, aka U.S. crude here, that's a little bit lower at about 25%. So not as much of a correlation with crude oil in the U.S. here versus Bitcoin. Getting to the metals, another category a lot of people like to conflate with Bitcoin. It's got coin in the name, right? It must be a metal out there. Silver, pretty decent correlation, 36% over the past year. Gold at about 33%. Getting beyond that, getting to some of the ags, you wouldn't expect to be a high degree of correlation there. And that's pretty much the case. Most of the major ags, your corns, your soybeans, everything else, all at about 19% or less. So not a heck of a lot of correlation there. So you can make the argument that's pretty uncorrelated to the ags if you were concerned about such things. FX, another area, currencies. People view it as a currency, so they kind of lump it in with that. The correlation between FX and rates also pretty low out there. Let's look at the rates. Like, so you're talking euro dollars, the 2-year treasury, the 10-year treasury, and even the FX. Most of those, like the pound dollar, euro dollar, the highest correlation we found across all those complexes was the pound dollar versus the Bitcoin. That was at about 17%. And everything else was pretty low, 15% or less, so not a lot of correlation there on the FX side, which is interesting because a lot of people lump it in as a currency. And on the rate side, certainly not. So the highest correlations you're going to see, which is probably the most meaningful correlation for a lot of you, because that's where a lot of your other assets are parked, are in the equities. So if you're viewing Bitcoin as this uncorrelated asset to equities, not so much. Not quite 50%, but it isn't that far from it either. So bear that in mind. We've seen it again over the past week and change as equities have mostly sold off. Bitcoin done something similar out there. So again, it's not uncorrelated. But again, we need to look beyond just, this is a very crazy year, so it's hard to draw too many conclusions from that. But we do have that crazy period in March, which is where if you're looking for something to be uncorrelated, that's where you want it to behave like that. And it certainly did not do that. So keep this in mind as you're looking at Bitcoin and other crypto investments and thinking of them as these isolated silos that don't move in lockstep with other markets. The answer is they do, and sometimes in more surprising ways than you might expect. All right, that's going to do it for this crypto quick hit. Still not that quick. Half an hour to cover all this data that's going on out here in the crypto world. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Remember, if you like what you hear, keep those reviews coming. We'll be back next week with more guests, more hot seat, more fun stuff in store for you in the world of crypto. In the meantime, of course, check out everything else we have cooking over there on the network. Volatility Views every Friday, the option block every Monday and Thursday. This Week in Futures Options, very relevant to this discussion we just had. That's on Thursdays as well. Wednesdays are education day, so if you're a little bit new to the world of options, Options Playbook Radio, Options Bootcamp. You guys love Options Bootcamp. Can't get enough of that one. Check out those shows on Wednesday, and of course, Tuesdays are interview day, so a lot of people joining us tomorrow to make up for some of the light couple of weeks we've had on that front. And back again to next week at another episode of the Crypto Rundown.
Listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com.